Well, the U.S. Congress failing to reauthorize, there are now concerns that the situation in the U.S., where there's no speaker in the House of Congress, has led to the fact that the PEPFAR program has not been renewed. PEPFAR has provided millions of people in our country with ARV drugs. In the U.S., Republicans won't authorize the program to continue because in some countries that program also provides advice on abortion. Michael Mynhardt is from Avacare Health Global. Michael, good afternoon to you. How important is PEPFAR to countries around the world and to people in our own country?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thank you for having me. Yeah, it's absolutely essential. If you look at the difference that they've made in diagnostics, in supplying medicine, and the impact they've had on supplying essential medicines such as HIV and antiretrovirals in Africa, it can't be overstated the impact that PEPFAR has. So this really is something to highlight and something for us to address quite critically at the moment.
If it hasn't been renewed, does that mean the programs just stop or only some of them stop?
It doesn't mean that it stops, and it certainly isn't the first time. It isn't the first time. It has happened in the past, and my feeling is that certainly it would be with the added pressure, and once it comes to the realization that this really does have a fundamental impact. But I think it's also just part of a much bigger picture. You know, the funding of antiretrovirals or HIV medicine is an element of the healthcare sector. You know, there's a bigger picture that's at play, which I think is also important to look at.
When you talk about a bigger picture, what do you mean?
You have to look at the full picture, and what I'm referring to is elements like local manufacturing, building infrastructure, becoming less reliant on importing medicines from international territories. You have to look at offtake agreements from public procurement agencies, from the government primarily, that's handing out these medicines typically free of charge. You have to look at technology transfers. You have to look at skills development, IP development. There's all these elements that all come to play within the healthcare sector, and of course the funding is a part of it and a critical part of it. But I think there's also a lot more for us to discuss, and this actually just has highlighted the reliance that continents like Africa have on the rest of the world.
I learned some time ago, Michael, not to make predictions about politics in the United States, but are you expecting PEPFAR to actually be reauthorized at some point in the future? I mean, you talk about a transition towards us becoming more reliant on ourselves, and that is correct, but it must be done in an orderly way, not necessarily through the sort of chaos and emergency like this could create.
Yeah, I mean, my personal belief is that they would renew it. I think that everyone understands the impact that they have and the role that they have to play. And that's really a short-term solution. 5 years is a short-term solution. I think we need to start thinking of the bigger picture. We need to start thinking of the medium and long-term solutions, and how do we create and develop self-sustainable funding models within a continent like Africa. So perhaps a part of me hopes that it gets renewed, and certainly a part of me really is confident that it is renewed. But I think everyone will really come to their senses and understand that this is something that's critical for the continent, and not to allow all the progress that's been made over the years to start regressing.
Michael, I mean, for ages, certainly since the start of the pandemic, and the lesson that Africa learnt, and I think President Ramaphosa reminded us of this, is that we can't rely on the rich world for pandemic, for vaccine doses in some situations. We need, as a continent, maybe also within BRICS actually, but let me call it the Global South, to work together to create our own manufacturing capacity. I'm afraid to say, despite the fact that this is pretty obvious and everyone says we must do it, I don't see much evidence that we're doing it.
There's slow progress, and I think there's a lot of hesitancy. If you look at the local manufacturing industry and you just think of it practically from a commercial perspective, there's a lot of funding that's required to set up the infrastructure. But more importantly, there isn't any firm commitment given to local manufacturers that they would actually be supported by the government if they do set up their factories or their institutions. So I think there's hesitancy to put a lot of capital into the industry, not knowing what the outcome is going to be, because you don't want a white elephant, on the continent where there's a factory that's got capacity to supply, but because of, perhaps the wage rates, or because of electricity, or because of the cost of operating, your price becomes uncompetitive to simply importing it from a country like India or like China, or internationally importing it from a different continent. So I think there is hesitancy because there's no surety given in terms of offtake agreements or support from the government to actually say that it'll be de-risked to an extent.
I mean, Michael, one of the strange things about economics is that it's actually cheaper to have one factory produce all of the world's vaccines. We haven't quite come to that, but the Serum Institute of India comes as close to that. If I recall, the United Nations actually had to intervene at one point when it comes to the production of the raw materials for antiretroviral drugs to make sure there are two separate sites in different places, because the economics led to the fact it would be cheaper to do it in one place. Do we need to be a bit cleverer about how we manage this?
Absolutely. I mean, serum is a great example, but, my view has always been when you're looking at importing products versus manufacturing it locally, it can't just be a decision between the price of one product versus the price of the other. You have to also look at economic stimulation. You have to look at the economic multiplier effect. You have to look at job creation. You have to look at skills development. There's other elements that need to be accounted for besides the price when you're looking at a local manufacturer versus simply importing the good from a different territory.
Michael Mynhardt from Avacare Health Global, really do appreciate the time.